So the question was, have we seen differences in intake or efficiency in steer and heifer? And we have done some of that work. There are differences. The positive thing that on those steers and heifers, steers on grain diet, heifers on forage diet, the correlation between that intake is about 60%. Now that's still a D, but that's a reasonable correlation for an intake there. There is plenty of re-ranking that still occurs. There's different mechanisms for intake, whether it's grain or forage, but you know, intake is far more repeatable than efficiency. Growth is not nearly as repeatable, especially over short periods of time. Right? We've done intake on different diet types at different stages through the growing period and looked at repeatability on consecutive 56-day periods. We've done intake on heifers, then again as 2-year-olds in production, and again as 5-year-olds. And through all those different stages of production and across diet types, intake is repeatable. Never that, you know, 90%, but always around that 50, 60, 65%, you know, so pretty repeatable. Intake, much more repeatable than gain. Consequently, efficiency doesn't maintain the same kind of repeatability.
Question for Dan. How confident are you in the continuation of funding for your research, and do you need more?
Always need more, always need more. You know, the funding landscape is challenging. I would say applied research focused in these kinds of areas has historically or recently in my career not been quite high, but recent shift at USDA, I would say that there appears to be, what I'm hearing, maybe a little more shift to outcome-based work. The last thing I saw come across my desk this week said they want to fund work that directly impacts farmers, ranchers, growers, where, you know, there had been a bit of a trend at more of that foundational, fundamental work, kind of curiosity work rather than application work. But at the end of the day, you know, funding on this kind of work, cow stuff, is slow, results are slow. So funding, it's some of the other things, like they can give money, they can see a result right away. But breed associations have had interest, but we always need more. Got a mic, or we can hear you.
About the early weeding and doing basically drought time. What age, what size are you looking at weeding them off?
Yeah, the question was about early weaning, and when we've done that, man, I think the most extreme example was in 2012. We had a fire that burnt right over the top of 4,000 pair, and amazingly, the cattle all survived. But we started weaning 3-month-old calves at 260 pounds average weaning weight in early August, and it was pretty impressive. I altered the diets for those when we got them in, because they're small, right, and their intakes aren't very high. So everything gets elevated up. You start thinking about nutrients in grams or pounds per day rather than ppms and percentages. But those little calves did great, and they didn't have a lot of problems. You can do it. It wasn't very fun in that scenario, but you can do it. And the calves did well. And as expected, they reached, you know, market weights quicker because they gained more in our grow yard than they would have on the cow.
At our Dixon Springs herd in southern Illinois, we're fall calving. For over 20 years now, we have weaned at breeding. When we pull a cedar, we wean the calves, so they're less than 90 days. You do have to have a totally different system for managing those calves. They are little, they will crawl through things, they need a different bunk height, they need a different diet type, but they do really well. And you get a bump on pregnancy. Now that's not for everybody, right? But in that system, rather than taking those pairs through the winter, that's what we do.
While we're waiting on the mic to get over there, just a reminder, there's some paper copies of the evaluation on the chairs. Be sure to fill those out. Also, we've got the QR code if you want to scan that and get that evaluation in. We've got a question over here.
You were talking a while ago about the environment, and and my weaning was going to be another question of mine, but I think that's already pretty much been answered. But from a benefit standpoint, early creep feeding calves to take the load off the cow looks like a dual benefit to me. But is there data to support that?
So the data on creep feeding and grazing systems is a little varied, and so it all depends on how early they started creep feeding. I mean, and calves, if just left to nature, they will eventually wean themselves, right? So, and every cow's got a little different kind of milk production, and so some calves will take to more forage, and they won't take to the creep. Some calves will take to a lot of creep, and they'll stop eating a lot of grass, which does help the cow, and some of them will stop or, you know, nurse less, which also helps the cow, but in a lot of cases, they nurse the same amount. And just eat additional creep, which replaces the grass, and whether or not that's enough to really benefit those cows kind of depends again on what time you started it in there. I don't know if you guys have probably not used creep feeding.
No, we haven't used creep feeding. If we feel like we're getting into some calf stress, we'll just wean them,
Yeah.
or cow body condition or lack of feed. Yeah. Those would be the three reasons. Yeah, the question was about our corn silage, yields. I mentioned we were getting 28 ton plus consistently. It's amazing the forage yields, the crop breeding. We talk about cattle genetics, but my goodness, these corn plants are bearing our pivots in size, and ears are getting bigger. Of course, most of your weight's in your ear, right? So it's not all judged by that corn plant size, but I think it's just crop genetics, and we're using minimal till, and so that doesn't mean we never till, but we're trying to conserve as much of the moisture that we're a limited moisture environment, and it takes a little over a foot of water. We've got about a foot of water to put on that crop, and so it takes a little more than that, and we depend on a little bit of the good Lord to provide something from above. But I think we found that with where we can get away without tilling, we're keeping more of that moisture in the soil, and we think some other nutrients as well, like carbon. But I think that's helped some, but I think crop breeding's a big part of it. And yeah, it's pretty impressive. And this truly is 85-day corn. Yes.
Hello, Dr. Patterson, you made some strong correlations to your business and the factory. And so in that factory setting, do you use market demand or market variability for the consumer in your modeling when you decide long-term, short-term stocking rates because of the consumer demand?
Yeah, the question was about, consumer demand and how that may impact our decisions and stocking rates. I think from a stocking rate standpoint, we want to be optimally stocked all the time, regardless of where the markets are at. And because even if you get a depression in demand and we got less money in the pool, we're going to have better margin in our business by having more throughput through the system. And it's all about dilution of overheads, right? And in our system, where because of our farm and feedlot operation, we're fairly high overhead business. And so it takes throughput to dilute that. So no in that regard. Yes in the regard that where we look at trends in that is trying to understand where the market is heading out in front of us. So let's say that we're in a situation where we're in a drought, and now we know we've limited our carrying capacity of our rangeland. We'll use those trends that include consumer demand to try to estimate where we think the market's going to go. Can we afford to buy our way out of that drought, or are we better off to cash out with selling some cows right now and then try to rebuild organically or sometime later? So that's where it plays into the picture. But the situation we're in now is the demand it has been amazingly incredible. And what that's done is just given us a bigger pie. And because of these supply shortages, at a cow-calf level, we're just getting a bigger slice of that pie. But with that, and the work that all of you have done in creating the quality of cattle that's increased that demand, and our breed associations, but our cattlemen's associations, working to enhance demand, my goodness, even when our leverage shifts, and it will shift, our leverage will go down. That's a given. I'd still rather have a smaller piece of a bigger pie than a smaller piece of a smaller pie. And so, but yeah, that's definitely a consideration. It's been a consideration in our risk management program right now, because I'm looking at how far out do we go out and protect some of these cattle. You know, how many do we lay off with forward contracting and hedges and so on? And the one thing we've been watching is demand, because there was some concern with the economic woes that demand would wane, and it hasn't. And so that if it would have, then we would have been even more aggressive than we were of getting out in front of this market, because I think it would have decreased the size of the pie. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, the 90-day weaning. What am I going to do with that cow for 9 months? Now, I could understand you with the ranch, but here in Kentucky, what am I going to do with that cow? She's going to lay around and just put on some fat.
Yeah, you should only do it if your cow is not able to maintain condition in your current system, right? This is not, and that kind of, especially that early of a weaning, that, in my opinion, that is not a standard production practice. That is a modification of a situation where we had the number of cows and the type of cows that had gone beyond what our system could do. We're in that part of the country where you could justify spring calving. Our problem was is if we calved in January or February, we didn't have the facilities or the labor to do that. And if we moved more to March, April, we were breeding too much in the heat on the fescue, and we were losing too much on the pregnancy side. When we went to fall calving in our university system, we can calve in September on union labor, because that's what we have, and they could leave at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and come back next morning, and the cows calved or they didn't, all right? And we bred in December, and we got good pregnancy rates. Problem was is we didn't have enough stockpiled fescue to get through the winter, and rather than feeding all those pairs, we just weaned the calves. And then those cows, we don't have to feed them very much through that winter. Even there, some of our cows will be approaching plenty fat when they calve. In that kind of system, we have much more of a roller coaster of body condition than I probably like, but the beef cow's pretty resilient, and she will do that. She'll lay down extra body condition when she's in a positive energy balance, and then she'll use it during those days when she's in a negative energy balance.
Just as a reminder, as we're finishing up the questions, don't forget the trade show is open. There'll be lunch down there, and the new barn talk sessions will start this afternoon, I believe, at 1 o'clock.
As a follow-up to that, and the feed supply, feed utilization, Dr. Patterson, you made reference to your heifer development and showed that the heifers developed on an open range gained more weight than the cattle in the feedlot. I would argue that in our feedlot, in our feed situation, our cattle that are fed on grass will gain a pound a day more than the one that's developed on straight grass. How do you make that comparison?
Yeah, so the question was about those gains that I showed on heifer development. So those were gains from spring turnout time in May until we AI'd the cattle in late July. And so it wasn't the gains during the winter. The cattle that we had on grass gained significantly less than those that were on silage in the feedlot during the winter time. But the one when we turned them all out to grass, some of them were already on grass, but when everything kind of started measuring that in May, we weighed them, they did better from that point on through the summer. They were compensating for some of that lost lack of growth in the wintertime. And I think most of the studies showed when you do that, when you restrict gain during the winter on yearlings, they're going to compensate somewhere between 60 and 70%, maybe up to 80 of that back, given how long you give them of that weight differential. They may never quite get back to that same level that you would have if you pushed them, right? But hope that answers your question.
I just want to jump on that. I love you showing that, and we've done some of that work as well. And the only difference that we've seen is if the system you're grazing them in and breeding them on is challenging enough that your first service heifer pregnancies are actually lower than if you develop them in a feedlot, that's where we've seen the benefit long term. And in your system, you got the same first pregnancy, so you really didn't weed any more out with either system. Because we do both. We develop some on grass, especially that fall calving, and they're pretty rough. And we breed them when they're pretty light, and we do not have heifer pregnancies that I want to brag about. They're kind of poor. But the ones that breed on that fescue they stay in our system. If we develop them on silage and distillers, we'll get greater heifer pregnancies, but then they fall out the next 2-3 years because we kind of masked that. So I do think in our country, you should try and develop them and breed them in the system that you're going to run them in when you can.
And yeah, Dan, and I think the important distinction, like in our system, is we weren't breeding until July, and so they had a couple of months of green grass to make that compensation. But totally agree with this concept of if your heifer development costs are low enough, the open heifers are likely profitable to sell or to feed. And I'd rather put some selection pressure on the heifer, have them fall out at a younger age, and then put some of that money back into getting your 2-year-old rebred. Yep. I think that's what the economics would indicate.
Well, I want to thank everybody. Let's thank our speakers one more time. On behalf of the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, KBN, the Kentucky Ag Development Fund, Dr. Jones and his wife as well, I want to thank all the sponsors for the program, and hopefully we'll see y'all back next year. Enjoy the rest of your